Who is Cernunnos, the mysterious horned god? Not who is just any horned god, but who is the Cernunnos, the god appearing on the Gundestrup cauldron and the pillar of the boatmen, assuming these might be the same god, and, when we are lucky, appearing with this specific name, Cernunnos or Cernunnos. I'm not going to spend time arguing against alternate interpretations here, such as Cernunnos being Pan/Gwydion, Rudra/Odin, or the Dagda. Instead, I'm going to present the most thorough mythic parallel for Cernunnos that has yet been presented. It's my belief that simply presenting this argument on its own will show by contrast how shockingly thin the evidence is for all other interpretations. This is the only interpretation that brings together a horned god type, mythic narratives that actually echo the Gundestrup cauldron image, and a god type that can be directly connected to the Cernu or Cornu root. Furthermore, this mythic parallel is incredibly deep and goes across Europe and beyond. All other attempts to identify Cernunnos have relied on one or two vague and questionable similarities and stopped there. For the first time, the full mythos of Cernunnos will be identified and explained. You aren't going to get this anywhere else. Following this argument out also reveals significant influence of the Indo-European Cernunnos myth even on one of the main biblical narratives, the Book of Exodus, which I will explore in Part 2. To understand this comparison does require some preliminary knowledge. The basis of this whole investigation is the ability to identify and agree upon the Rudra-type god across multiple mythological traditions. Odin as the Rudra-type god of Germanic myth, Fionn and Gwyn as the Gaelic and Welsh equivalents. Then also the fact that two separate gods are parallels of Rudra in Mediterranean myth, Cronus as the primordial aspect of this god type, the divider of earth and sky, and Apollo as the other aspect of the same god type, more active and present to the world. Yes, I assert that Cronus and Apollo are esoterically linked at their base. This plays itself out even in Sumerian myth, where Enlil is the Rudra-type divider of earth and sky, the primordial Rudra, and Nergal carries the other part of the Rudra-type mythos and is called Junior Enlil and Enlil of the homeland to make clear this connection. Please see my Indo-European creation myth videos, my video on Fionn, and especially my book chapters on these two topics for more information. Without understanding that the Rudra-type god is the one who separates earth and sky and essentially castrates or mutilates the genitals of his father Sky in most mythologies, and has a certain set of other characteristic myths, this video simply won't be understood. Please follow these preliminary arguments up before telling me I'm wrong. If you are skeptical of this Rudra equation, then suspend your doubt and test the hypothesis for a while, and I will show you how these figures have another major set of aligning myths that bring them together. Also see Chris Kershaw's book, The One-Eyed God, Odin and the Indo-Germanic Mannerbund, for a deeper dive showing how Odin, Apollo, and Fionn in particular are the same god type as Rudra. But to begin with, Rudra is not Cernunnos per se. The Rudra-type god is in fact the direct opponent and even the hunter of Cernunnos, the horned stag god. For Rudra is the hunter god, and Cernunnos the rebellious deer. If you want to understand Cernunnos, you have to first understand the horned god, the stag god of the most detailed surviving Indo-European corpus we have, the Vedic. The Vedic horned god and the Vedic stag god is the god Prajapati. This is quite clear in the corpus and is not very disputable. From Stella Cromrich's work, The Presence of Shiva, we read, quote, "The primordial paradigmatic myth of Rudra is told in the Maitrayani Samhita of the Black Yajurveda. Father Heaven, henceforth acting under the name of Prajapati, Lord of Generation, desired his daughter, Ushas, the dawn. She became a female antelope. He became an antelope and pursued her." Unquote. And then, quote, "Prajapati, the Lord of Generation, in the shape of an antelope, cohabited with his daughter. Rudra hunted the antelope, unquote. And lastly, quote, Prajapati pierced, sprang up and became the constellation Mrga, the antelope, Orion, unquote. From Aitareya Brahmana 3.33. Kremish goes on to discuss how the deer and the antelope are interchangeable in this myth type. Rudra, on the other hand, is not the horned god in a meaningful way. Rudra does get called a bull in the Rig Veda, hymn 2.33.15, see also Mahabharata 7.173.30 through 31, but almost every male Vedic god is called or compared with a bull or buffalo at one point or another. The bull, which is also Shiva's mount, is important to Shiva, and it is on his banner even. But it is clear that none of the Cernunnos reliefs and statues that we have show Cernunnos having bull horns. Stag-like or antelope-like horns are the most common Cernunnos horns in the artifacts we have. This is not to say that the type of horns couldn't have changed between cultures, because they could, but we must bear in mind that a bull comparison is extremely generic and nearly ubiquitous among male deities, and Rudra and Shiva themselves are generally not depicted as literally horned in any of their traditional artistic depictions or their depictions within mythic narrative. Shiva, who is the lord of animals, or Pashupati, is sometimes depicted holding a deer, but he is not the deer. Rudra Shiva is lord of the animals and is a hunter. The deer he holds is traditionally identified with mind, Manas, and Manas is repeatedly identified with Prajapati, or perhaps Soma Prajapati, in the Brahmanas. Thus we already know who the stag form horned god most usually is in Vedic myth. It is Prajapati, the god who is also the totality and lord of generation. The horned deer form is apparently symbolic of both the skittish, leaping mind and the generative and indeed progenitive vital power of Prajapati, because it is in the form of a deer that Prajapati enacts perhaps his most central and infamous myth, when he couples with his own daughter in antelope or deer form. This myth, wrapped in taboo, is the paradigm of generative action, as it is the first moment that the primordial unity is broken by the spilling of the sacred liquid that is Prajapati's semen. See The Presence of Shiva, Chapter 1, Section 5. Thus, the horns of the deer are symbolically virile, connected to sexuality and all kinds of growth, animal and vegetative. All things are generated by the Lord of Generation, who is the totality of what is. As Francisco Marco Simon says of the horns of Cernunnos, quote, the horns are taken to represent aggressive power, genetic vigor, and fecundity, unquote. That is from Religion and Religious Practices of the Ancient Celts of the Iberian Peninsula, from the Journal of Interdisciplinary Celtic Studies, 6. As Jan Gonda notes, quote, Prajapati likewise abounds in generative energy, Prajananavant, from Atharva Veda 19.17.9. He is the most energetic of the gods, Virya Vatma, who takes precedence, from VS 22.5, unquote. In particular, Prajapati generates or creates both deities and animals, his creatures. Thus, there are a sequence of important mythic scenes in which Prajapati is surrounded by the animals he has created. This image already reminds us of Cernunnos of the Gundestrup cauldron, perhaps more than any other myth does, since Cernunnos too sits surrounded by animals, while himself wearing horns on the Gundestrup relief. This is not all, though. In these same myths of creation, Prajapati also performs tapas, ascetic austerities of focusing inner energy and heat, essentially involving a type of meditation, along with other practices. Prajapati performs tapas, in some versions, to generate the creatures. Then the creatures require food, and so Prajapati performs tapas to generate food for his creatures. Next, death rears its head and makes itself a terror to the creatures. In turn, Prajapati invents rites and magical incantations that defeat and subdue death. rites, and magical incantations that he teaches to the gods and creatures so that they too can overcome death. As such, Prajapati, Lord of Generation, is actually also the god who first invents rites and magic and is quintessentially a god of ascetic practice and tapas in his central mythos. This again is neatly in accord with the image of Cernunnos on the Gundestrup cauldron, who is seated with legs folded in a pose that has frequently been compared to that of meditation. Furthermore, Cernunnos grasps a serpent that appears to be lunging toward his face, restraining it. Is this act comparable to Prajapati subduing death? Is the deadly serpent here symbolic of death, overcome by Cernunnos among his creatures while performing tapas and a magical rite? Or alternately, is the serpent a symbol of the Rudra type god, who is the opponent who attacks Prajapati? Indeed, the Rudra type in his primordial form and death sometimes do run together esoterically and overlap. Quote, Kaiser Sereth associates the ram-headed snake of the Gundestrup cauldron with the dragon hoarding riches, a familiar motif from Europe to India and China, and considers this a symbol of death, of the otherworld, of disorder. Sereth considers Cernunnos as the mediator between this chthonic disorder and the well-being of the living, just as he is the mediator between nature and culture. Thus, on the Gundestrup cauldron, Cernunnos restrains the serpent in order to free up the wealth that he has accumulated. Cernunnos would thus be the key player in a constant conflict between prosperity and death, which is perhaps to be linked with the motif of the equestrian Jupiter triumphing over giants with serpentine legs, unquote. From Carnonoi to Cernunnos, from deomercurio.be/en/Cernunnos.html. Jan Gonda gives extensive citations of these core myths of Prajapati on the creative primordial scene. From Shatapatha Brahmana 2.5.1.1, we find that Prajapati first created living beings. Quote, Verily, in the beginning, Prajapati alone existed here. He thought within himself, how can I be propagated? He toiled and practiced austerities. He created living beings. While praising and practicing austerities, Prajapati thought within himself, how comes it that the living beings created by me pass away? He then became aware that his creatures passed away from want of food. Unquote. In Shatapatha Brahmana 7.5.2.6, he creates living beings and food from his body. In Jaiminiya Brahmana 3.7, he is born with papman, that is, evil. He sacrifices and pushes it away. In Jaiminiya Brahmana 1.283, he suggests a ritual means of ridding death and evil. Jaiminiya Brahmana 2.228, he creates creatures in succession, reptiles, fish, birds, and they perish. Death, that evil, overpowers him, so he performs tapas for 1,000 years to overcome it. Shatapatha Brahmana 10.4.4.1, evil overpowers him. He practices austerities to overcome. Quote, when Prajapati was creating living beings, death, that evil, overpowered him. He practiced austerities for 1,000 years, striving to leave evil behind him, unquote. Shatapatha Brahmana 10.5.2.3, despite their antagonism, death does not die because he is within the Amritam, the deathless. In Shatapatha Brahmana 8.4.2.1, Prajapati becomes pregnant with all beings, and death seizes them within his womb, and he frees them by a ritual act. Quote, from when that part of his body had been restored, Prajapati became pregnant with all beings. Whilst they were in his womb, evil, death, seized them. He spake to the gods, with you I will free all these beings from evil, from death. What will accrue to us therefrom? Choose ye, said he. Let there be a share for us, said some to him. Let lordship be unto us, said others. Having bestowed a share on some and lordship on others, he freed all beings from evil, from death, and inasmuch as he freed them, therefore those bricks are called sprita. And in like manner does the sacrificer, by bestowing a share on some and lordship on others, now free all beings from evil, from death, and hence the word spritam, freed, recurs with all of them. Unquote. Quote, here Prajapati is the great mythical example whose archetypal ritual activity in beginning enables the one who knows how to repeat it, to produce from his own benefit a new creation, to make a new beginning, and to work the wonder of his own periodical salvation from death." Unquote. Prajapati drives off evil in Shatapatha Brahmana 8.5.1.6, cuts off its root. In verse 13, frees himself from it, 8.5.2.1, or tries by practicing tapas to leave it behind himself, 10.4.4.1. In Atharva Veda 2.1.7, he appears as a highly placed supervisor of ritual affairs, and that will become important later. Quote, "Prajapati seems to have been the protector from death par excellence." Unquote. That is from the scholar Jan Gonda. Compare Jaiminiya Brahmana 2.283. Also, when the gods were afraid of death, they resorted to him in PB 22.12.1 and 23.12.2 and 24.19.12. In KB 21.1 and Jaiminiya Brahmana 2.69, to do so, they needed to behold a rite that would allow this. Quote, "Vedic man is not convinced that all power belongs to him. He is not presented as being able to realize his ambitions instantaneously or without appropriate preparations. He needs to receive a vision, to use a Vedic chant, PB 7.5.1, Jaiminiya Brahmana 3.104, compare Shatapatha Brahmana 6.2.1.1, or a stanza, to practice asceticism or to undertake a rite that leads to the result desired." Jan Gonda, Prajapati's Rise to a Higher Rank, page 30. Now, while Prajapati is technically the inventor of the sacrificial rite, Prajapati also is the sacrifice itself, just as he is the totality. This identification of Prajapati with the sacrifice is repeated frequently in the Brahmanas and related texts. Thus, when Prajapati feeds the creatures and subdues death from his own tapas and ritual action, this process is a paradigm of the sacrifice, a tableau of the sacrifice, which echoes through myth and rituals thereafter. Note how Prajapati isn't explicitly described as horned in these narrative myths of ritual creation, that only occurs in separate myths. With this understanding of Prajapati, we can begin to look closer at certain myths that begin to give the outline of a possible Cernunnos mythos. But first, we must also understand one specific aspect of Prajapati. When Prajapati sacrifices in the myth of primordial generation, it is said that he becomes Daksha. Kramrish narrates, quote, "In the beginning, Prajapati desired offspring, sacrificed. He was Daksha." Shatapatha Brahmana 2.4.4.1-2. Brahma, the Puranic version of Prajapati, in creating Daksha, recreated himself. Unquote. Daksha then is the title of one of Prajapati's modes of action, and specifically it is his role of expert ritual sacrificer. Prajapati is the totality and fountainhead of the gods, and so his aspects or modes of action can split or rather emanate off as their own deities. This is what happens with the individual god Daksha, who is treated as an emanation or son of Prajapati/Brahma, born from his thumb, and is really a continuation of Prajapati's expert sacrificer aspect. Therefore, Daksha is the expert sacrificer among the gods, and carries forward this role one level below Prajapati to signify that he is directly embodying a role of Prajapati himself and has a special connection to that godhead. Daksha plays a key role in what will become our Cernunnos myth parallel. So aligned with the apparent Cernunnos role is Daksha that it appears the Cernunnos we see in myths and reliefs may frequently have been this specific emanation of Prajapati, his expert sacrificer role. The key myth in question has Daksha in a tense rivalry with none other than Rudra Shiva. Rudra Shiva's wife happens to be the daughter of Daksha in this version, and so she places herself in the middle of this dispute, creating a three-pointed structure in the dispute. The two rival males, Rudra Shiva and Daksha, and the female, who is connected to each. I point this out because this structure remains in most of the parallels we will be examining, but the exact relationship of the three figures often changes. What remains mostly constant is that we are dealing with the Rudra-type god, a rivalry with another male god, and the female consort of the Rudra-type god, who often enters the center of the conflict. In the Daksha myth, she is daughter of the rival god, but in other branches, she is not. She is his master and he is her servant, or the servant of both her and the Rudraic god. This is perhaps an understandable shift when we consider how Daksha is indeed of a lower station than Rudra Shiva, and indeed, as ritual expert, fulfills a sort of serving role to the higher gods. Daksha's lower status related to Rudra Shiva is even central to their dispute, so this shift isn't too drastic. But in Germanic and Celtic branches, the Rudra-type god's consort is presented as the lover or would-be lover of the rival, with hints of a variation of the same in Greek and Roman versions. This then seems very different from Sati being daughter of Daksha. Yet, if we hold in mind the deeper structure that will repeat over and over again in these various versions, and the fact that such relationships can shift while still communicating the same core myth, the other details will confirm that these are indeed forms of the same original myth nonetheless. Daksha's myth unfolds as follows. Brahma, also known as Prajapati, is giving a sacrificial feast at which the gods attend. When Daksha arrives, all of the gods but Brahma and Shiva stand to acknowledge and show respect. We read from the Wikipedia summary of the myth, quote, "All of them came for the yajna, the sacrificial feast, and sat in the ceremonial place. Daksha came last. When he arrived, everyone in the yajna, with the exception of Brahma and Shiva, stood up, showing their reverence for him. Brahma, being Daksha's father, did not rise. Shiva, being Daksha's son-in-law, and also due to the fact that he considered himself superior in stature to Daksha, remained seated. Daksha misunderstood Shiva's gesture and considered this act an insult. Daksha vowed to take revenge on the insult in the same manner." Unquote. Daksha is deeply offended by Shiva remaining seated, not standing for him. Shiva was of a higher status than Daksha, and thus his action was not intended as an insult, but apparently Daksha did not fully comprehend this fact at this time. As a result, subsequent to Brahma's sacrificial feast, Daksha decides to put on his own sacrifice, to which he purposely does not invite Shiva. Now is where Shiva's wife, who here is Daksha's daughter, Sati, places herself in the middle of the conflict. Appearing more offended than Shiva by the snub, Sati goes to Daksha's sacrifice and confronts him about not inviting Shiva. Daksha, unrelenting, harshly insults Shiva in response. The insult reaches such a magnitude that Sati cannot bear the shame. She goes to the fire and immerses herself in the flame, committing suicide, going to the divine realm until she later reincarnates as Parvati. Learning of this act, Shiva is finally moved to action against Daksha. He forms two terrifying emissaries or emanations from locks of his hair, Virabhadra and Bhadrakali, and sends them to destroy Daksha's sacrifice. In variant versions, either Daksha or the sacrifice itself flees in the form of a deer. We can already understand the overlap on this detail since Daksha is an emanation of Prajapati, who is the sacrifice and the deer god. The gods attending the sacrifice are each maimed in a characteristic way. Pushan's teeth are smashed out, Bhaga's eyes are poked out, Savitar's hands are cut off, etc. The gruesomeness of the disfigurements is part of the message. In one variant that seems to meld the primordial attack of Rudra upon Prajapati, which had happened previously, with this attack of Rudra on Daksha's sacrifice, we read that Rudra shoots his arrow at the sacrifice itself, filling it with destructive power. Pushan bites into it and breaks his teeth out, the result being the same as the other version of the destruction of Daksha's sacrifice. There are indeed numerous versions of the myth, all with slight differences. Finally, Daksha is apprehended and beheaded, but the sacrifice being destroyed and Daksha being punished, Rudra Shiva allows a goat head to be placed on Daksha's neck, reviving him. From being an emanation of Prajapati the deer god and fleeing in deer form, Daksha is now given the form of another horned animal, the horned goat, and it is in this form that he is best known. Daksha gives fealty to Shiva and extols him as the great god of the universe, and he is forgiven by Shiva. Try to keep as many of these details in mind as we explore other parallels, as some of the details change while the core of the myth tends to stay the same, along with various telltale details. Indeed, the fact that some elements change in the various versions is part of what is so interesting. It reveals to us what is most important in the underlying theological structure, and it also tells us about how each branch wanted to tell the story or alter the theology to suit their own tradition. Stella Cromrish explains how the myth of Daksha is a direct echo and afterimage of the primordial attack on the sacrifice, who is Prajapati, by Rudra, in the first sacrifice of all. Quote, Daksha's sacrifice had its precedent in which Daksha did not figure at all. There it was the gods who excluded Rudra from the sacrifice. Cf. Mahabharata 10.18.2-4. Rudra's exclusion from the sacrifice, whether by the gods or by Daksha, and his winning his share by destroying the sacrifice, became the recurring themes in common to all versions of the myths. Cf. Taittiriya Samhita 2.6.8.3 and Shatapatha Brahmana 1.7.4.1-17. Unquote. And also, quote, the primordial sacrifice in which the father/Prajapati was the victim, the paradigmatic ritual sacrifice celebrated by the gods, and the sacrifice of Prajapati Daksha succeeded and substituted for one another in the ongoing myth of Rudra. According to the Mahabharata, the sacrifice, following the primordial sacrificial pattern, was offered by the gods after the Krita Yuga had passed. Rudra was excluded from the sacrifice because the gods did not know him truly. Though he looked like a Brahmacharyan, clad in an antelope skin, he also carried a bow. He was Mahadeva, the great god, whom the other gods had not recognized and to whom they had assigned no share. Enraged, Rudra went to the sacrifice and, while the earth trembled and the stars wandered in irregular courses, his arrow pierced the heart of the embodied sacrifice. In the shape of an antelope, it fled to heaven. After the sacrifice had fled along with Agni, the sacrificial fire, the gods lost their creative powers. Rudra deprived Bhaga of his eyes and Pushan of his teeth. Laughing aloud, he paralyzed the other gods. They sought his protection. Unquote. The Hittite version of this myth provides an example very similar to the Vedic version, but furthermore features a rebellious reformer of the sacrifice, who is even more emphatically and clearly the horned deer god, and who even bears a name that is a variant of the root of the name Cernunnos. This is the stag god called Kuruntia or Kurunta. Again, this name is closely related or cognate to the name Cernunnos itself, and as such is the closest name and myth combination to Cernunnos that exists. Credit to Arno Preiner for pointing me toward the crucial Kurunta mythos, and to Josephus for pointing out that Kurunta is indeed attacked by the forces of Kumarbi, who is the Rudra-type god here. Kurunta is apparently taking a provisional kingship that has been allowed to him too far, changing the ways in which people sacrifice to the gods, indeed making people think they don't need to sacrifice to the great gods, such as Kumarbi and El. Whatever that means specifically is somewhat unclear. Scholar Volkert Haas in Die Hethitische Literatur says that, quote, under the dominion of Kurunta, mankind lives in vain joy, disregarding the gods. Kurunta, in arrogant pride, refuses to worship the great gods. He is a rebel who also makes mankind rebellious. Rebelliously, he refuses the gods the demanded offerings. Therefore, Ea of the Apsu and Kumarbi decide to deprive him of the kingship in heaven, unquote. The fragmentary text CTH 351, which is KUB 36.32 plus KUB 36.55, edited by A. Archie, reads, quote, Ea began to speak to Kumarbi. Come, let's turn around, for this Kurunta, whom we have made king, just as he himself is unfit, so he is also unfit for the lands, so that no one offers food and drink offerings to the gods. Unquote. Notice how this is all about offerings and how Kurunta has changed the ritual practice of the people to exclude the high gods from their sacrifice. We then read that forces are mobilized against Kurunta, and as the two destructive emanations, Virabhadra and Bhadrakali, carry out the violence in the Vedic version, so two war gods carry out the violence in place of Kumarbi and Ea, these high gods remaining remote like Shiva does. These two war gods are Tarhunta and Ninurta, gods somewhat similar to Indra and Vayu, and prominent gods in their own right, like Indra and Vayu. The text continues, quote, Tarhunta and Ninurta, his vizier, text missing, and they treated Kurunta in the same way. They trampled him down, spread him out, and cut or parted from his back. But the Igdu part of him they cut or divided." Unquote. Volkert Haas explains, quote, "They probably slaughtered and skinned him. What follows is a speech by Kurunta, which is no longer understandable due to the fragmentary state of the text, but which shows that he recognizes the rule of Tarhunta." Unquote. He gives a speech recognizing the rule of Tarhunta after being slaughtered and skinned, and parts of his body separated from his back. Clearly, Tarhunta, the Thunderer, and emissary of Kumarbi and Ea, is being given a bit more central role in this myth compared to the Vedic and other versions, and this is in keeping with his enhanced role in the Hittite pantheon. This aside, we can see once again the Rudra and Prajapati type gods, who are Kumarbi and Ea, who remain relatively remote, being poised against the rebellious lesser horned god who enacts a policy that reforms sacrificial practice and stops these high gods from receiving sacrifices. Kumarbi is the primordial Rudra or Cronus type god, as he severs the genitals of Anu, the sky, in a myth long recognized by scholars as equivalent to the myth of Cronus and Uranos. Again, I have maintained that this role of the one who severs the genitals of sky is a core Rudra-type myth, reflected in Rudra's attack on Daksha while in the sexual act found in 2 hymns of the Rig Veda. See my Indo-European creation myth video for an in-depth discussion. Thus, the Rudra and Prajapati-type gods, Kumarbi and Ea, once again send 2 emissaries to stop the horned god here, and they violently maim and apparently kill him. Yet miraculously, as when Daksha is beheaded, but revived again with a new head and then extols Shiva, so Kurunta also apparently does just the same. He gives a speech of fealty to Tarhunta this time, after he has been cut apart and slaughtered by him. As noted previously, connecting Kurunta to this Daksha myth parallel really anchors the parallel to Cernunnos, as Kurunta is the name and myth combination that can be most strongly connected to Cernunnos of any deity we have record of. From this core parallel, we can begin to identify the likely Celtic Cernunnos in surviving narrative myths. It may be surprising that a Hittite god exists in surviving myth with a name directly connected to Cernunnos, but no Celtic figure of the narrative myths with such a close name and myth makes himself apparent, despite Cernunnos famously being a name attested from Celtic inscriptions. The name of this god clearly changed and shifted among the insular Celts, at least, or other titles of this god were simply favored when referring to him in narrative. What we have from the myths of the insular Celts does point directly to a parallel to the Daksha and Kurunta myth type, with enough uncanny shared details to be confident of the parallel. This brings us to the Gaelic text, Fionn and the Man in the Tree. Remember that the first signpost for a parallel to the Daksha myth is that it involves the Rudra-type god in rivalry with another male god, and the female consort of the Rudraic god may or may not step into the middle of this rivalry to bring about conflict. Thus, we would need to find a myth of the Gaelic Rudra-type god, who is Fionn, where he is positioned against a rebellious rival, with Fionn's consort as the expected third member of the drama. Now, Fionn has disputes or violent fights with numerous opponents, and more than one of these involve his consort stuck in the middle, namely Fionn against Fair Dorach, with Sive in the middle, Fionn against Diarmid with Grania in the middle, perhaps even Cúil against Taig with Myrna in the middle, if we understand Cúil as another form of the Fionn-type god, as we should. These are each tempting tales to parallel to the Daksha myth, but none are the correct parallel for various reasons. We have already thoroughly and definitively categorized Diarmid and his myth as being of the Yama type in another video, and the details of the story do not conform well to the Daksha pattern. The Cúil myth is instead the more primordial creation event involving what is called the Vratya, who sparks the female aspect within Prajapati, leading to the birth of Mahadeva Rudra in the Atharva Veda, as it is in the Cúil myth the birth of Fionn mac Cúil in this Gaelic version. I will explore this parallel in a future video. The Fair Dorach story may parallel a different demon conflict of Shiva, Andhaka, as I touched on in my Taliesin's Treasures video, and ultimately lacks the characteristic details that would align it with Daksha's myth. Fionn and the Man in the Tree is one of the earliest texts we have in the Gaelic corpus, and indeed in the whole Northwest European mythic corpus, dating to the 8th century, so its authenticity is not doubted by any who understand the Celtic corpus in the least. And ultimately it turns out to be the one story of a rivalry involving Fionn that has the uncanny details allowing us to make a lucid identification with the Daksha and Kurunta myths. The text of Fionn and the Man in the Tree reads as follows, quote, "Sometime afterwards, they, i.e. the Fionn, carried off captive women of the Dun Iashkag in the land of the Deshi. A beautiful maiden was taken by them. Finn's mind desired the woman for himself. She set her heart on a servant whom they had, even Jered Kora, son of Oidaira, for this was his practice. While food was being cooked by them, the lad jumped to and fro across the cooking hearth. It was for that the maiden loved him. And one day she said to him that he should come to her and lie with her. Jered Kora did not accept that on account of Fionn. She incites Fionn against him and said, 'Let us set upon him by force.' Thereupon Fionn said to him, 'Go hence,' said he, 'out of my sight, and thou shalt have a truce of 3 days and 3 nights, and after that, beware of me.' Then Jered Kora went into exile and took up his abode in a wood, and used to go about on shanks of deer for his lightness. One day, as Fionn was in the wood seeking him, he saw a man in the top of a tree, a blackbird on his right shoulder, and in his left hand a white vessel of bronze filled with water, in which was a skittish trout, and a stag at the foot of the tree. And this was the practice of the man, cracking nuts, and he would give half the kernel of a nut to the blackbird that was on his right shoulder, while he would himself eat the other half. And he would take an apple out of the bronze vessel that was in his left hand, divide it in two, throw one half to the stag that was at the foot of the tree, and then eat the other half himself. And on it he would drink a sip of the bronze vessel that was in his hand, so that he and the trout and the stag and the blackbird drank together. Then his followers asked of Fionn who he in the tree was, for they did not recognize him on account of the hood of disguise which he wore. Then Fionn put his thumb into his mouth. When he took it out again, his imhas illumines him, and he chanted an incantation and said, "'Tis Jered Kora, son of Odaira," said he, "that is in the tree." Unquote. To summarize, we have Fionn in a rivalry with another male, and Finn's unnamed consort places herself between the two males, directly inflaming the situation and necessitating a confrontation, as in the Daksha version. As previously mentioned, clearly the female is not presented as the daughter of the opposing male, as in the Vedic version, and instead she creates a would-be love triangle by trying to seduce this opposing male, Jered. Nonetheless, if we persist past this seeming discrepancy, I believe the underlying structure shines through with plenty of clarity. Finn's woman attempting to seduce Jered expresses her closeness to that god, as does Sati being Daksha's daughter. Both are snubbed and offended by that opposing male in different ways. Sati snubbed from invitation to his feast and insulted by his words. Finn's woman snubbed from his embraces and thus also insulted. Let's not forget that the outcome of the woman's attempt here is that she is shamed, and Fionn must address this shame by confronting Jered, while Sati also is shamed by Daksha with his words, and her honor leads her to enter the fire, leading to Shiva's reaction. It will be interesting to note for future parallels how Daksha as sacrificer and emanation of Prajapati also symbolizes the sacrifice by proxy, and is even identified or absorbed into Agni as Prajapati is. So when Sati enters the fire, she in a way unites herself with the sacrifice of which Daksha is proxy. Meanwhile, Finn's woman attempts to unite with Jered. Clearly, the Indian version is at pains to emphasize the faithfulness of Sati. Yet Sati also goes directly against Shiva's wishes by going to Daksha's sacrifice uninvited, and then uniting with the fire there. Thus, this moment of going against Shiva, generating the moment of shame before Daksha in his presence, and inciting the need for Shiva to confront Daksha, seems to be what the Gaelic version is expressing in a different symbolic form, as an attempted sexual liaison and accusation of rape. Knowing the Indian tradition's propensity to clean up shocking and sexual mythic details over time, and the fact that Gaelic, Welsh, Norse, and Roman versions all suggest some sort of love triangle or illicit relationship here, and also the notable fact that Daksha is said to be punished by having to become lover of a separate daughter of his, while in no other branch does Daksha's mythic parallel appear as father of this female in question. It seems more prudent to assume some shift has occurred to clean up the Indian version on this point, and to make Sati the daughter of Daksha. In addition, Jered Kora, Finn's rival, is portrayed in an extremely brief description, which, however, matches the core description of Daksha to a precise degree. Daksha is the ritual expert who, as such, works adeptly around the fire pit. The fire pit with food cooking on it is a symbol of the sacrifice, the sacrificial food that cooks over the fire, and Daksha is said to be dexterous as well as energetic. It is precisely Jered's energy and dexterity of leaping across the fire pit that Finn's woman admires and becomes enamored of. In reality, this is a carefully worded allegory of the action of the expert and energetic and dexterous sacrificer. Daksha's name is actually defined as having meanings perfectly describing Jered. From the Practical Sanskrit English Dictionary, Daksha is defined as able, competent, expert, clever, skillful, and also as the fifth definition, a lover attached to many mistresses. From Monier Williams' Sanskrit English Dictionary, Daksha is defined as able, fit, adroit, expert, clever, dexterous. Scholar Jan Gonda says that Daksha embodies, quote, the desire to make the personified cleverness, dexterity, and prompt effectiveness a manifestation of Prajapati, which means emphasis on this aspect of the god's personality. Cf. Taittiriya Samhita 3.5.8.1. Quote, I take thee for Prajapati full of light, for Daksha who increases in ability. Unquote, unquote. So indeed, the woman is really shown here becoming enamored of the energy, dexterity, and adroit skill or ability of the sacrificer god, who is equivalent of none other than Daksha Prajapati. Indeed, this scene of Jered leaping across the fire cannot truly be understood in any other way than as combining energy, dexterity, and skill specifically around the sacrificial fire. Jan Gonda notes that the ritual sacrificer, who stands for Daksha, symbolically steps through and rises out of the sacrificial fire while chanting the Prajapati mantra and thereby identifying with or attaining Prajapati in that moment. The sacrificial officiant comes up out of the fire, quote, at a given moment, the officiant puts on another garment and comes up out of the fire, Agni udeti, i.e. steps over the piece of burning charcoal used for kindling the fire. With Rigveda hymn 10.121.10, the Prajapati Rik BS 2.1151.17, that is, the Prajapati mantra par excellence, unquote. This may be essentially what is being directly represented in the description of Jered, leaping adroitly over the fire as the Vedic sacrificial officiant steps over it. Thus we find that the Jered myth begins with a sacrificial scene, as the Daksha myth also begins at the first sacrifice given by Brahma. But when Jered runs to the tree in the forest, he enacts a second sacrificial scene or tableau, and thus the Jered and Daksha myths have the same structure of two back-to-back scenes of sacrifice, highly coded, with the offense to the woman occurring between them and linking them. After Jered is accused of trying to sleep with Finn's consort, he flees, and it is said that he, quote, goes about on deer shanks for their lightness, unquote. This is a reference that in a human context could perhaps be argued to refer to a hunter or fugitive simply performing stealth, running like a deer. But these are myths of gods, and each symbol is carefully chosen and meaningful, even if they are concealed in a humanized, euhemerized form. Underlying this act of going on deer shanks was then likely the taking of an actual deer form by this god, if this parallel holds. Just as Daksha, or the sacrifice, flee from Shiva in deer form, so Jered just so happens to flee from Finn on deer shanks in the comparable moment. Even more, though Jered Kora's name is not etymologically the same as Cernunnos or Cernunnos, it still apparently means red-peaked or horned one, with Kora being a word that can mean peaked but also horned, peaks being a common analogue of horns in the Old Irish language. The electronic dictionary of the Irish language entry for cor, C-O-R-R, definition number 2 says, quote, projecting part, end, corner, peak, etc., used of a wide variety of objects, unquote. And then it lists a couple of places where a form of the word cor, C-O-R-R, is used as an alternate of the word cornu, C-O-R-N-U, to mean horns of the altar. Thus, cur na haltora and quir des na haltora are compared with the Latin cornu altaris, making cur, C-U-R-R, a form of the word cor, equivalent to cornu here. The same is demonstrated when a form of the word cor is used to translate the horns of the altar in Jeremiah 17.1. See the text on screen, and thus we see that the word koriv equals horns. Cornu would be the form of the root of Cernunnos' name that we would have expected in Old Irish if it remained exactly the same. So Kora, relative to cornu, is actually a close and established alternate, and so ultimately Jered Kora is a close-sounding synonym of Cernunnos. Jered Kora then is the horned red one, or the peaked red one, going on deer shanks, his deer aspect being confirmed from two separate angles. The cornu one, Cernunnos, has simply become the Kora one in this case, with the same meaning, a slight change similar to that between Toran and Turin, noted in my Thunderer video. Now, just as the scene of Jered leaping the fire pit as it cooks food at the start of the story was an image of the sacrifice, and just as the Daksha myth is framed by two scenes of sacrifice, so also Jered going into the tree and feeding the animals is also a symbolic tableau representing the sacrifice. When Fionn finally tracks Jered down and perceives him with his mystical sight, Imhas, he is standing in a tree with very intense mystical imagery around him. He is feeding three animals, a blackbird, a stag, and a trout, by hand. The blackbird he gives hazelnuts, the stag he gives apples, and all three he gives water, while himself partaking of half of each as he gives them to the animals. This is such an intense image of the sacrificial rite that it even brings to mind the actions of the Christian priest giving communion, blessing and distributing the wafer and wine, while also eating and drinking a bit himself. Thus, we would almost think this could be connected to Christianity if it weren't for the saturation of pagan imagery and mythos, and the fact that we can trace this myth back to the more universal tradition of sacrifice and esotericism, reflected in other rituals around the world, and particularly in the Vedic tradition, where Prajapati/Purusha is the sacrifice, the cosmic man who gives of his own body to be eaten. This food and attendant rites being what defeats death and leads to life eternal. Jered's actions mirror that of a ritual priest, but he is also standing in a tree, the tree being the symbol of Prajapati himself, called Bila in Gaelic tradition, the sacred tree, and thus it is very much like he is aligning and uniting himself with his higher ruling deity, as Daksha Prajapati becomes like Prajapati and unites with him when he performs the sacrifice as Prajapati had performed it in the primordial moment. The horned and deer-shanked one, Jered, posed in the tree, giving the food to the animals, further echoes the specific scene where Prajapati gives the food to the creatures he has created, and I assert is also the closest scene we have in any Celtic narrative myth to the scene on the Gundestrup cauldron with the horned one surrounded by his animals. In my view, this scene with Jered surrounded thus, plus his name and deershanks, is what all but confirms him as directly connected to the figure on the Gundestrup cauldron. When you add to this the fact that Jered's myth can be lucidly paralleled to that of Kurunta, the only other Indo-European god with a name definitely connected to Cernunnos, it seems clear that no other god in Celtic narrative myth has as strong a claim to being Cernunnos than Jered and his higher Prajapati self. Jered's sacrifice is also clearly secretive, perhaps unlicensed, as Daksha's is, with Fionn certainly not being invited, as Shiva also is uninvited to Daksha's sacrifice. Instead, Jered is hidden so well, perhaps with a magical concealment, that Fionn has to use his divinatory second sight to identify who he is. The tripartite form of Jered's tableau is also significant, as he feeds three animals, one of the kingdom of the air, one of the lands and one of the water. The blackbird, stag, and trout are all rather noble or even druidic animals in Gaelic symbology, and so it is doubtful that the animals represent the three social classes, i.e. priest, warrior, and producer. Instead, the most straightforward interpretation seems to me to be that a tripartite division of the cosmos is being symbolized, as noted, air, land, and water, though other interpretations are possible. Regardless, triple divisions in general have the meaning of totality, all three of the divided cosmic domains of life, aligned around this center point, brought together in a powerful image of unity. This powerful image of unity around the tree, in turn drives home that this is indeed an image of the sacrifice. Thus, all it takes to identify the story of Jered as a parallel to the Daksha and Karunta type is to spot the two scenes of sacrifice, and then to understand that the relationship of father-daughter between the rival and the involved female is rare within the myth type, and may be a modulation unique to the Vedic version, while the core conflict can remain the same, regardless of whether she is daughter of the rival or in a love triangle with him. Along with this, the point about the female really being enamored by the sacrifice itself should be remembered, as it comes into play in other branches, such as the Norse and Roman. As we might expect, the Welsh tradition also has its own version of this myth, but it preserves a set of fascinatingly different details. As with the Gaelic version, to find this parallel, we must start with the Rudra type god, here Gwyn and Gwythyr, the cognate of Fionn wa Nuada, and then we must look for a rivalry where a female comes in the middle, possibly a love triangle if it is consistent with the other Celtic branch. The only obvious option turns out to be the right option in this case, as the love triangle of Gwyn, Gwythyr, and Creidalad is one of Gwyn's central myths. The passage is from Cullach and Olwen. Notice how the same basic patterns play out as in the Gaelic version, with Gwyn even intervening before Creidalad and Gwythyr sleep together, as Finn's woman also only attempts to sleep with Jered, but the tryst is not fulfilled. Quote, a short while before this, Creidalad, daughter of Llŷth Silverhand, went with Gwythyr, son of Greidawl, and before he had slept with her there, came Gwyn, son of Neath, and carried her off by force. Gwythyr, son of Greidawl, gathered a host, and he came to fight with Gwyn, son of Neath, and Gwyn prevailed, and he took prisoner Greid, son of Eri, Glynau, son of Taran, and Gurgrist, half-naked, and Dinarth, his son. And he took prisoner Pen, son of Nethaug, and Mwithun, and Killidir, the Wild, and his son. And he slew Natun, and took out his heart, and compelled Killidir to eat his father's heart, and because of this, Killidir went mad." Unquote. Gwyn and Gwythyr are rivals for the hand of Creidalad here, forming a straightforward love triangle. However, it is implied elsewhere that Creidalad is the consort of Gwyn, and in the conflict between Gwyn and Gwythyr for the hand of Creidalad, Gwyn apparently comes out victorious by capturing Gwythyr and his allies. King Arthur steps in, however, and essentially takes Creidalad away, as if to the other world, so that the rivalry will have to be fought out again and again every Calan Mai or May Day until Doomsday. Presumably, Gwyn wins every year, and this is an explanation of a holiday that occurred on that date, commemorating this mythic conflict. Additionally, Creidalad, being taken away from Gwyn even as he defeats his rival, is in close alignment with how Sati goes away to the underworld by suicide, despite Shiva violently defeating Daksha that same day. When Creidalad is taken by Arthur, it is indeed like she disappears for a time to the other world. The violence of Gwyn's defeat of Gwythyr is also crucial, for just as Shiva gruesomely maims the other gods at the sacrifice with Daksha, so Gwyn imprisons the allies who were with Gwythyr and forces one of them, Killidir, to eat the heart of his father, Natun. Interestingly, while in some versions of the Daksha's sacrifice myth, Pushan has his teeth kicked out by Shiva's emissaries, there is, as aforementioned, a variant where Rudra Shiva himself shoots the sacrifice with an arrow, and this causes the sacrifice to become dangerously potent. The gods bring it to Bhaga, and it burns out his eyes. They bring it to Pushan, and he tries to eat it, breaking his teeth. Now, the sacrifice here is explicitly identified with Prajapati, but also with Vishnu in the Daksha sacrifice mythos generally, who is called by the epithet Yajna, meaning sacrifice, Yajna Purusha or Yajneshvara, an important fact we will return to more fully later in the video. Thus, when Kelidir is made to eat his own father's heart, this apparently brings together the sense of gruesome violence by which the divine attendees are maimed, and also the forced eating of the now terrible sacrifice, like in the scene with Pushan. Thus, the capture of Gwythyr's allies and this gruesome scene of eating the father's heart is actually the remnant of the violence and the scene of the sacrifice in this much compressed and coded version. You will begin to notice that each branch has a different symbol for the sacrifice, but underneath they mean the same essential thing. This is why Kelidir is forced to eat his father Naton's heart. We can also say that Gwythyr is in a similar relationship to Gwyn as Jered is to Fionn, since Cullaig and Olwen, Gwyn and Gwythyr, are actually questing together alongside Arthur to retrieve the blood of the hag Orddu. Thus, Gwythyr is a companion, presumably subordinate, of Gwyn, as Jered is the servant of Fionn. Perhaps of interest, Gwythyr is the one who encounters a burning anthill and communicates with the ants after rescuing them. In Vedic tradition, anthills belong to Prajapati and are said to be his ears, that is, that through which he can be spoken to. Thus, since fire is also identified with Prajapati, we have to wonder if the burning anthill is a symbol of Prajapati, and if this is another moment of the Daksha Prajapati type being aligned with his higher Prajapati self via an image of sacrifice. As when Jered shows his kinship with and skill around the fire by leaping over it. So the encounter with the burning anthill may be another detail pointing to the alignment of Gwythyr with Daksha and the Prajapati type grouping as a whole. Note also that Gwythyr is not marked by any deer or horn imagery. So we see that the deer imagery, though important, sometimes may drop away despite the mythos remaining recognizable. Having established the pattern a bit more fully, we may now return to a key part of the Gaelic parallel that we left unaddressed. You may recall that Fionn and the Man in the Tree ends with Fionn finding Jered, giving his rustic sacrifice, and identifying him with his second sight. But this tale does not contain the scene of great violence we have found in all other versions thus far. The tale simply ends there. Clearly, Fionn has tracked and found Jered in a hostile mood and with a specific purpose in mind. He is not just on a sightseeing hike. He has hunted Jered, like the deer he seemingly is, in direct response to the shame he allegedly has caused to Finn's woman and to Fionn himself, just as Shiva also hunts Daksha down in response to the shame done to his wife, with that pursuit ending in total slaughter. Fionn is poised against Jered. We know what is likely to happen to Jered once he is caught performing his sacrifice. We can fill in the blanks ourselves. However, I believe there is also a coded version of this very scene of violent attack to be found in a completely separate text of the Gaelic corpus, and with Fionn and Jered bearing different names and even different forms. The heavily coded nature of these mythic narratives should be familiar by now, and so this shouldn't be a big surprise. Having established that the Welsh battle of Gwyn and Gwythyr occurs on May 1st, the end of winter and start of summer, with this motif even surviving in folk customs of the Welsh, a positioning that also repeats in the Roman version of the myth, as we will see, we begin to perceive an important dimension of this myth. It is about the transition from winter to summer. Even the Indian version makes sense if mapped onto this time frame. Thus, if Welsh and Roman versions of the Daksha-type event happen on May 1st, this may be supported by the Vedic thematic structure of the myths. Daksha, as the echo of Prajapati and a lord of energy, is opposed to Shiva, just as Prajapati had been, by standing for energetic generation rather than wintry restraint, as Rudra Shiva famously meditates during winter until his February marriage to Parvati, and is also identified with the guna of darkness. The guna of darkness belongs to Rudra Shiva. Daksha's horns, like Prajapati's, are indeed symbolic of the lusty force of procreation and life that he embodies. In short, the god of the horns is a god of summer, while the ascetic lord of containment is lord of winter, and so the fact that these two clash on or around May 1st at the changeover from winter to summer is undoubtedly significant. Interestingly, Shiva, the lord of winter and darkness, actually wins the confrontation, even though winter is ending and summer beginning. Yet, in the conclusion, Daksha is restored to life, and Shiva goes into the wilds on a self-imposed exile to mourn his deceased wife. And so Daksha, in a sense, comes out on top in the end. As such, the confrontation is really a clash of great violence in which Shiva shows his supremacy, but the summer lord Daksha Prajapati is the one left standing with his lusty horns, while Shiva recedes from the scene. Considering this, it may be that originally the Shiva-type gods, grief and self-imposed exile, signified the withdrawal from the world of Rudra Shiva, the lord of winter and destruction, during the time of summer, centering on the changeover from winter to summer, or May 1st. This implication remains consistent in other branches we will look at as well. With this understanding, we can identify the likely Gaelic version of the violent confrontation between the forces of Rudra Shiva and Daksha. This may seem counterintuitive, but we should be used to the fact that the true solution often hides in the counterintuitive by now. Despite appearing in a completely different text with its own narrative, it is my staunch belief that the battle of the two great bulls, the Dawn Kulna and Fionn, is in fact the coded depiction of the violent scene that would have occurred when Finn's forces confronted Jered after finding him in his tree, the parallel of the brutal destruction of Daksha's sacrifice. This scene has a few elements that suggest this interpretation. Gory violence including dismemberment, and even more specifically, the body parts of one of the individuals involved being carried by the victor across the land, with these body parts specifically falling to the ground and marking sacred sites as he goes. In the Indian story, this is the peculiar result of Sati's death. After she has immolated herself and Shiva has maimed Daksha, Shiva takes Sati's burnt remains and carries them on his pilgrimage of grief across the wilds. Parts of her ashes drop here and there as he goes, and these sites become holy sites. In similar fashion, when the Dawn Kulna kills Fionn, he also finds himself mortally wounded. Thus, like Shiva, despite his victory, he embarks on a tragic pilgrimage across the land, carrying parts of the body of Fionn. Where these parts fall, important sites are marked. In Sumerian and Ugaritic versions of this myth, the Rudra-type god fully goes to the underworld. Thus, the Dawn Kulna, dying in the end, may signify the same thing, the receding from the world of the winter force, the darkness force that Shiva represents. Thus, the Dawn Kulna as the Pyrrhic victor who brutally dismembers his opponent and then goes on a tragic pilgrimage across the land, carrying body parts and dropping them to mark important sites, clearly parallels Finn and Shiva, while his opponent, Fionn, clearly is in the position of Daksha or Jered Kora, indeed like a continuation of Jered Kora. This is another major counterintuitive hurdle, because looking at the names of the two bulls, one would surely think that Fionn would align with Fionn/Finn, and the Dawn Kulna would thus represent an opponent of Finn, possibly Jered. I was stuck with this thinking for a long time, and even briefly speculated that Fionn could be Finn in my previous writing. But we need to learn how to identify which unproven assumptions need to be rethought, which superficial similarities are really red herrings, and the idea that Fionn has to be the god Finn, though reasonable, is actually quite thin and based only on the name, which we are probably misunderstanding in its context. Clearly, it is the Dawn Kulna who matches the mythic role of Shiva/Finn as I've laid it out, and also connects to Shiva's identification with the guna of darkness. Shiva is not the defeated party in the violent altercation as Fionn is. Instead, he recedes tragically after the clash. He is precisely the tragic victor, who then pyrrhically sinks away afterwards, as the Dawn Kulna is. As Shiva goes into a period of grief in the wilds, so the Dawn wanders and dies, despite victory, signifying the power of the god receding to the underworld. Understanding the seasonal connections of these two combatant gods finally solves the puzzle of the names of the bulls. In the names of the two bulls, we are presented most straightforwardly with a blatant contrast of dark versus light, Dawn versus Fionn. Dawn means dark or black, while Fionn means white or indeed bright. What the seasonal framework allows us to see is that just as Gwyn fights Gwythyr at the turning point from winter to summer, and as Shiva embodies the force of winter and darkness against the summer-coded god of horns and Prajapati vivacity, so the Dawn Kulna stands for the dark half of the year, opposed to the generative forces of the light half of the year, signified by the name Fionn. The names of the bulls do not correspond to the god names, they are plain color coding of the seasonal division, and it is a pure irony that the dawn really stands for Fionn, while Fionn instead stands for his opponent. The fact that this version of the mythic event has been reduced from using god names to a seasonal color coding implies how much this version has been simplified and boiled down into more direct symbol language. This could suggest that this form of the story was composed at a late date, or perhaps the Druids simply didn't get tripped up by these confusing details, since the intention behind the symbol language was native and obvious to them. After all, the bulls' names are black and white, dark and light. Perhaps we should have seen what was in front of our faces more quickly here, and the true answer is the more simple and obvious reading. I believe the name Fionn does, however, contain a clue that confirms this interpretation, for just as we are dealing with the horned one here, Cernunnos, who becomes Jered Kora, the horned red one, so again Fionn name means the white horned, with Venach, Beannach, meaning horned, and being another synonym of Cornu and Kora. Of course, we should picture both the Dawn Kulnya and Fionn as horned, and this is only a corollary of the animal form they've been given as stand-ins. Yet it is only Fionn of the two who has horns mentioned directly in his name, and given the mythic parallel, this must be a meaningful remnant and a hint of his true divine identity. So simply realize the bull names are seasonal color codes, dark and light, winter and summer, and correctly identify Finn/Shiva as the god connected with the dark half of the year and the guna of darkness, and nearly every mythic parallel suddenly falls into place, complete with the word for horned appearing in the name of the bull who stands for the horned one. Indeed, Fionn is Cernunnos in bull form, while the great epic centering around the exploits of the Vishnu-type hero Cuchulainn is named after a bull who is actually an incarnation of the Shiva type, a bull everyone, even Cuchulainn, is either protecting or pursuing, the Dawn Kulnya, the heart and essence of the Tan Kulnya. Finally, it seems clear that in the boiling down of this tale, the female has disappeared and her role has been absorbed into the simplified narrative in order to focus on the conflict of the two bulls. I believe that this solution to the riddle of the two bulls is so complete that no other solution is likely to come along and explain it better. Thus we have the first part of the Daksha myth in Finn and the Man in the Tree, and the violent conclusion encoded in the Battle of the Bulls that is the conclusion of the Tan Kulnya. And combined, we have the full Rudra Shiva versus Daksha narrative paralleled. And furthermore, the name of Fionn is one more piece of evidence supporting the idea that this is the myth of the Horned One, the god called Cernunnos or Cornunnos. If we apply what we have learned of this pattern, we can identify parallels in several more branches. The aforementioned Roman version can be identified briefly. Credit to Josephus for pointing the Roman Shiva parallel and this myth out to me initially. The Roman Shiva is apparently Faunus. Faunus's name indeed being cognate with the name Shiva and meaning merciful or favorable, while Shiva means auspicious or favorable, and Shiva is of course the merciful face of Rudra Shiva as well. Wiktionary states that Faunus is from Proto-Italic Fawe or Fawono, variant Fawonjo, thus being cognate with Umbrian fons, Fons, Foner, meaning merciful. It may be ultimately derived from Proto-Indo-European B superscript H, H subscript 2, U-N, meaning favorable. Faunus was conflated with Greek Pan and given horns at a later time, but did not have horns originally in Roman tradition. Odin and Kian, aka Finn MacKinley, are cases where the Rudra, Shiva, and Pushan or Pan types are conflated, so we know this conflation frequently is approved in tradition. Nonetheless, Faunus is not quite the same god as Pan. Faunus is connected to prophecy like Rudra Shiva is, and of course is a god of the wild. See also Nekas Hraste, Daniel Vukovic Kresimir, 2011, article entitled Rudra Shiva and Sylvanus Faunus, Savage and Propitious, from the Journal of Indo-European Studies, 39. To be clear, Saturn is the primordial Rudra form equivalent to Cronus, and I have been consistent on this, while Faunus is the Shiva or Rudra Shiva operating more so in the world, comparable to Apollo. Thus, following our established patterns, we must ask if there is any rivalry or conflict that also involves his consort, anything resembling a love triangle or a similar tension where the female steps into the middle of the tension is found in the Faunus mythos. There is indeed one candidate, which, when decoded, appears to be a form of this precise myth type. Two key points must be remembered for this interpretation. Daksha is an emanation of Prajapati, who is the sacrifice itself. Thus, Daksha esoterically blends into the sacrifice he gives, as when Jered almost seems one with the fire pit he leaps, and then sits at the center of the sacrificial tableau in the tree. Daksha is indeed esoterically identified with the fire Agni, just as Prajapati is. Second, fire, food, the heart of the father, and golden statues, as we will see, can all be symbols of the sacrifice, as of course the deer itself can. But along with food, there is another classic symbol of the sacrifice, and that is wine, which in the Holy Grail legend and other Christianized contexts became indeed one of the most central symbols of the sacrifice. In the story of Faunus and his consort Fauna, instead of Fauna becoming enamored of the sacrificer god, as in the case of Jered, Fauna becomes enamored of wine directly. But read symbolically, this should be taken as representing Fauna becoming enamored of the sacrifice itself, with the sacrificer god absorbed into the symbolic sacrifice that the wine represents. As we read a summary from Wikipedia, quote, "Several variants are known. Fauna is daughter, wife, or sister of Faunus, also named Faunus Fatuus, meaning Faunus the foolish or seer. Faunus was son of Picus, and was the first king of the Latins, empowered with the gift of prophecy. In Roman religion, he was a pastoral god and protector of flocks, with a shrine and oracle on the Aventine, sometimes identified with Inuus and later with Greek Pan. As his female counterpart, Fauna had similar gifts, domains, and powers in relation to women. In Plutarch's version of the myth, the mortal Fauna secretly gets drunk on wine, which is forbidden her. When Faunus finds out, he thrashes her with myrtle rods. In Lactantius's version, Faunus thrashes her to death, regrets the deed, and deifies her. Servius describes the names Faunus and Fauna, collectively the Fatui, from Farai, to prophesy. They are also called Fatui because they utter divine prophecy in a state of stupor. Macrobius writes that Bona Dea is, quote, the same as Fauna, Ops, or Fatua. It is said, too, that she was the daughter of Faunus and that she resisted the amorous advances of her father who had fallen in love with her, so that he even beat her with myrtle twigs because she did not yield to his desires, though she had been made drunk by him on wine. It is believed that the father changed himself into a serpent, however, and under this guise had intercourse with his daughter." Unquote. So, in most versions, the wine is forbidden, she is enamored by it and drinks it. This brings shame to Faunus, and he enacts the characteristic violence on her, this time beating her, sometimes to death. We can then see how the specific roles of who does what to whom exactly are fairly malleable, as long as the core meaning and outcome remain the same. Fauna ends up dead after a violent outburst of her husband, and it is a result of shame brought on by becoming enamored with the stand-in for the sacrifice. Her husband even regrets it and deifies her, similar to Shiva's grief carrying Sati through the wilderness. Given the fragmentary nature of the Faunus mythos, this is a strong possible parallel, but it is further confirmed by a final detail. The death of Fauna at the hands of Faunus was apparently commemorated on May 1st, the same day as the commemoration of the Welsh parallel. From Macrobius we read, quote, "Cornelius Labeo writes that to this Maya, that is the earth, a shrine was dedicated on May Calends, that is May 1st, under the name of Bona Dea." Unquote. This Bona Dea he also equates with Faunus explicitly. My colleague Josephus summarizes the rest of the connection. Quote, "Then Macrobius goes on to say that pontifical books themselves equate this Bona Dea with Fauna and other goddesses, and tells a version of the Fauna myth. By Fauna's death under the influence of wine and beaten with a myrtle stick, the author finds an explanation for the taboo on wine and myrtle sticks in the aforementioned shrine. We know from Ovid that rituals were performed in the temple on May 1st every year by Livia, wife of High Pontiff Augustus. She was presumably reviving an archaic tradition that had fallen out of usage after a number of scandals relating to the goddess's mysteries. As the cult of Bona Dea had only been discontinued for a few decades, we can reasonably assume that Livia was relying on an unbroken tradition." Unquote. This detail of Fauna becoming too enamored of the substance of the sacrifice itself also repeats in the Norse version, as we will see, which reciprocally supports the conclusion that Fauna's death is indeed the correct parallel for our pattern. Fauna is the parallel of Sati after all, and so their deaths should parallel anyway, with the additional details simply adding to this alignment. It's not like Sati or Parvati have a different death that Fauna's death could be paralleled with instead. This brings us to the Norse version. Once again, we apply our criteria. Identify the Rudra Shiva type god, and then find a rivalry or conflict that involves his consort getting in the middle of it. A closely matching instance indeed exists, involving Frigg, the wife of Odin, indeed having an illicit affair, with several details that align with the other myths we have examined. This story, appearing only in the pseudo-history of Saxo Grammaticus, Gesta Danorum, has often been accused of being untrustworthy or fabricated by Saxo entirely, insulting to Frigg, the product of Christian slander, etc. However, we can now see that this is an authentic, very ancient, and extremely important myth, and that discarding or disparaging it would be to throw away a key piece of Frigg and Odin's story. And this would be to throw away a priceless mythic gem that has been carefully and miraculously preserved for us. We don't get to decide what is or isn't insulting to the gods when a story is this well supported from all sides. Those who passed down this deep tradition were trying to say something specific here, and perhaps we should listen. Since Finn's woman directly attempts to sleep with Jered Kora, and Fauna becomes enamored of and indulges in the prohibited wine, we can see that there is no good reason to consider Frigg sleeping with the servant to be an outlier and a fully fabricated detail here. It is entirely consistent with the underlying meaning and general details of these other versions. The one who Frigg sleeps with is even a servant of Odin and herself, while Finn's woman likewise attempts to sleep with a servant of Finn's. The shameful affair even directly centers around an explicit symbol of the sacrifice. Frigg has become enamored of gold, as Fauna was enamored of wine, and so she orders a statue, one that is specifically directed toward the worship of Odin, to be stripped of gold and then broken down so that she can greedily cover herself in this gold. Once we know the parallels here and know that the gold of the sacrificial idol is a clear symbol of the substance of the sacrifice, we can see that the true core of the story involves Frigg being enamored of the substance of the sacrifice, as well as being caught up with the servant sacrificer god, as Sati also goes against Shiva's wishes just to attend the sacrifice of Daksha. Then Frigg even covers herself in the substance of the sacrifice she has illicitly gained, as also Sati covers herself in the sacrifice itself, that is, the fire of Daksha. These symbols flow and blend together, but once the pattern is seen, it is remarkable how consistently the key moments hold, even in these late fragmentary versions. The direct outcome of Frigg going to the embrace of the servant and covering herself in the substance of the sacrifice is deep shame to Odin, as the outcome of Sati going to Daksha and then covering herself with sacrificial fire is the deep shame and grief that falls upon Shiva. Even more specifically, this event causes Odin to take upon himself, quote, an exile overflowing with noble shame, unquote, very much like Shiva's self-imposed exile of grief in the parallel moment, and the story ends with Odin's wife's death. This is unmistakable. Here is the full episode from Gesta Danorum, Book 1. Quote, the king of the north, desiring more zealously to worship his deity, Odin, embounded his likeness in a golden image, and this statue, which betokened their homage, they transmitted with much show of worship to Byzantium, fettering even the effigied arms with a serried mass of bracelets. Odin was overjoyed at such notoriety, and greeted warmly the devotion of the senders. But his queen, Frigga, desiring to go forth more beautified, called smiths and had the gold stripped from the statue. Odin hanged them and mounted the statue upon a pedestal, which by the marvelous skill of his art he made to speak when a mortal touched it. But still Frigga preferred the splendor of her own apparel to the divine honors of her husband, and submitted herself to the embraces of one of her servants. And it was by this man's device she broke down the image, and turned to the service of her private wantonness that gold which had been devoted to public idolatry, that is, religious practice. Little thought she of practicing unchastity, that she might the easier satisfy her greed, the woman so unworthy to be the consort of a god. But what should I add here, save that such a godhead was worthy of such a wife? So great was the error that of old befooled the minds of men. Thus Odin, wounded by the double trespass of his wife, resented the outrage to his image as keenly as that to his bed, and, ruffled by these two stinging dishonors, took to an exile overflowing with noble shame, imagining so to wipe off the slur of his ignominy. When he had retired, one Mythothin, who was famous for his juggling tricks, was likewise quickened, as though by inspiration from on high, to seize the opportunity of feigning to be a god, and wrapping the minds of the barbarians in fresh darkness, he led them by the renown of his jugglings to pay holy observance to his name. He said that the wrath of the gods could never be appeased, nor the outrage to their deity expiated by mixed and indiscriminate sacrifices, and therefore forbade that prayers for this end should be put up without distinction, appointing to each of those above his especial drink offering. But when Odin was returning, he cast away all help of jugglings, went to Finland to hide himself, and was there attacked and slain by the inhabitants. Even in his death, his abominations were made manifest, for those who came nigh his barrow were cut off by a kind of sudden death, and after his end he spread such pestilence that he seemed almost to leave a filthier record in his death than in his life. It was as though he would extort from the guilty a punishment for his slaughter. The inhabitants, being in this trouble, took the body out of the mound, beheaded it, and impaled it through the breast with a sharp stake, and herein that people found relief. The death of Odin's wife revived the ancient splendor of his name, and seemed to wipe out the disgrace upon his deity. So, returning from exile, he forced all those who had used his absence to assume the honors of divine rank, to resign them as usurped, and the gangs of sorcerers that had arisen he scattered like a darkness before the advancing glory of his godhead. And he forced them by his power not only to lay down their divinity, but further to quit the country, deeming that they who tried to foist themselves so iniquitously into the skies ought to be outcasts from the earth." Unquote. So we have consort of the Rudra type becoming enamored of the substance of the sacrifice, and the Rudra type goes on self-imposed exile due to these events, followed by a rebellious sacrificial reformer, and the death of the Rudraic god's wife. This tale hits every key point, despite superficial differences from the other versions. Odin also has all of the smiths who stripped the gold hanged, which may parallel the gruesome violence against the gods who attend Daksha's sacrifice. Now, it's my belief that, despite relating the narrative of a new figure named Mythothin, the paragraph that immediately follows Odin's exile may instead be another event in this Daksha-type parallel. It's all one story here. Perhaps Saxo truly was a bit confused about the split between these paragraphs, or they were split up differently in the Norse version, as the story of Mythothin seems to have key details that parallel details in Daksha's myth, and so somehow Mythothin appears almost like a continuation of the servant that Frigg embraced, the Daksha type. Perhaps by becoming sovereign lord of the illicit sacrifice in the absence of Odin, the servant became known as Mythothin and ruled temporarily as such. Or perhaps instead, Mythothin parallels a different god who is present at and central to Daksha's sacrifice. I will explain what I mean. More than simply being a rivalry where a rebel performs an illegal sacrifice or where a love triangle takes place, the Daksha's sacrifice myth is a myth about the ideology or theology of the sacrifice itself. What is it about? What must be included? What indeed is the theology or metaphysic behind it? This theme is elaborated in some variants of the myth and left implicit in others. But the version found in the Vayu Purana, for example, makes this clear. What is at stake in the illegal sacrifice of Daksha is that he gives a sacrifice excluding Rudra Shiva, pointing out that there are many Rudras, and so the higher Rudra Shiva himself need not be invited. In some versions, Vishnu is propitiated instead at the sacrifice. In others, it is not specified. But it is made clear here, in response to Daksha's trivializing and excluding Rudra Shiva, that Rudra Shiva is in fact the transcendental God who is in all things, that he is within the sacrifice, and so by excluding him from the sacrifice, they are excluding the God who is the transcending and unifying principle itself. Their sacrifice is imperfect and incomplete. This is a clear message of Shiva-centric monism of some kind, and it should be obvious what it means to exclude the very God of unifying transcendence who is the essence of the sacrifice from the sacrifice. How serious and foolhardy it is to do so. It implies worshipping other gods without the unifying divinity and without essence. In a similar, albeit different manner, the narrative of Mythothin is also about the theology behind the sacrifice and its proper performance. As the passage on Mythothin reads, he said that the wrath of the gods could never be appeased, nor the outrage to their deity expiated by mixed and indiscriminate sacrifices, and he forbade that prayers for this end should be put up without distinction, appointing to each of those above his especial drink offering, that is, his separate, special drink offering. What is the sacrificial ideology being pointed to in this confusing yet highly charged passage? Clearly, Odin and his sacrifice are positioned in the narrative as the better or correctly aligned example, despite Saxo's disparaging anti-pagan commentary on the surface. Mythothin, as the events make clear, is perverting the sacrifice and its ideology away from the correct Odinic model of sacrifice, in Odin's absence. This Odinic-aligned sacrifice involves, quote, indiscriminate and, quote, mixed offerings to the many gods at once. Given the framing and the positive role of Odin as the correct sacrificial and sovereign example in the narrative and pantheon, it is clear that indiscriminate, translated from Saxo's Latin, is being used not in the common negative sense, but in the more neutral archaic sense, meaning simply mixed, not discriminate, i.e. not separate, plain and simple. This is also clear as Odin's indiscriminate, that is, mixed sacrifice, is directly contrasted to Mythothin's giving of separate sacrifices to each individual god, their especial drink offerings. This is also strongly supported by the surviving direct god invocations we have from Norse sources, which, as the user Hvij, H-W-I-J, points out, all name all of the gods, mentioning, quote, the favor of all the gods, unquote, or, quote, the gods, the goddesses, unquote, and, quote, all the yin holy gods, unquote. This unity of invocation is further supported by other passages in the corpus that clarify the underlying theology. Thank you again to Hvij. Quote, relevant parts are Sigdrifumal 1-2, Lokasena, both of which are about the drink sacrifice, and Grimnismal 42 about the fire sacrifice, unquote. As the post from the user Einherry puts it, quote, in the Eddic and Skaldic poems, the gods either act in total unison or are referred to as a totality of the divine. In the words of Hathkin from Hakonarmal, the funerary poem of the Norwegian king Hathkin or Hakon the Good, the king is welcomed in Valhall by the totality of the divine. Stanza 18. In the dreams of Baldur's Dramar, all the gods act in complete unison. See stanza 1. And an identical formula is found also in the Lay of Thrym, Thrymskvida, stanza 14. Quote, soon were all the Aes, the gods, all at the thing, and the Ossens, all at speech. And of this counseled the mighty Tews, how they the hammer of Lorid, thunder, would seek out. Unquote. The gods act in total unison in the Völuspá, stanzas 6 and 9. In the speeches of Sigdrifumal, we find all the divinity evoked in the context of prayer, stanza 3. In the speeches of Grimnismal, we find all the divinity invoked in a ritual context, stanza 43. Quote, the holdness, that is favor or grace, of Ullr, and of all the gods, has each who first touches the fire. For the homes become open over the sons of the Aes, when the cauldrons are heaved off, unquote. Einherry concludes, quote, all of this goes to show that the gods are not separate from each other, unquote. And furthermore, if there is a uniting essence between them, the highest god, Odin, would necessarily fill this role, a theological position this story of Mythothin seems to dramatize. It is likely for this reason that Odin insists on mixed offerings, while Mythothin's ritual theology of separating the gods and treating them as pure individuals is shown as incorrect and strongly heretical, as violating the core principle of the unity of the gods. As we had seen in the Daksha myth, Shiva is directly put forward as that god which transcendently dwells within all, and thus within the sacrifice, uniting all the gods and the totality through his essence. In the conclusion of the version from the Shiva Purana, Shiva specifically asserts that one of the grave sins in worship is to separate the gods Vishnu, Shiva, and Prajapati, as they are all aspects of one godhead. We read, quote, in that supreme soul universal God, which is the pure self, the ignorant sees different living beings, Brahman, Ishvara, etc., even as an ordinary man does not consider his head, hands, and other limbs as separate from his own self, so also my follower does not feel separateness about the living beings. He attains peace who does not see any difference among the three deities, who constitute the soul of all living beings, and who have the same innate property, O Daksha. The base man who differentiates the deities of the Trinity certainly stays in hell as long as the moon and the stars shine. My devotee may worship the gods, being so absorbed he will attain knowledge, leading to external salvation. The Vayu Purana reads, quote, why do you not offer homage to the god who is the Lord of life? The invocation that is not addressed to Isha, that is, Shiva, is for all but a solitary and imperfect summons. Inasmuch as I behold no other divinity who is superior to Shankara, Shiva, this sacrifice of Daksha will not be completed. Unquote. Quote, Devi spake, the Lord God lives in all bodily forms, and his might is eminent through his superior faculties. He is unsurpassable, he is unapproachable in splendor and glory and power. That such as he should be excluded from his share of oblations fills me with deep sorrow and a trembling. O sinless, seizes upon my frame. Shall I now practice bounty, restraint, or penance so that my Lord, who is inconceivable, may obtain a share, a half or a third portion of the sacrifice? Then the mighty and incomprehensible deity, being pleased, said to his bride, thus agitated, and speaking, slender waisted queen of the gods, thou knowest not the purport of what thou sayest, but I know it, O thou with large eyes, for the holy declare all things by meditation. By thy perplexity this day are all the gods, with Mahendra and all the three worlds, utterly confounded. In my sacrifice, those who worship me repeat my praises and chant the Rathantara song of the Samaveda. My priests worship me in the sacrifice of true wisdom, where no officiating Brahman is needed, and in this they offer me my portion. Devi spoke, the Lord is the root of all, and assuredly in every assemblage of the female world praises or hides himself at will. Unquote. Daksha had here been worshipping Vishnu, separated from the excluded Shiva, in violation of these theological dictates. Thus, the heresy of Daksha and Mythothin's sacrifices can be seen to bear upon the very same theological issue, with at least similar core messages. Do not separate the worship of the gods, which strongly implies, do not make a hard distinction between the gods. The ritual worship of the gods is based on some underlying theology, and so this insistence on a mixed worship must also imply, do not conceive of the gods as truly distinct, as they are in fact always united. And Shiva or Odin both seem to stand as the binding essence between the gods in their respective traditions. A hymn of the earliest layer of the Rig Veda strongly points to a theology of imperishable unity underlying the gods, even at this earliest point of the Rig Veda. Jameson and Brereton, the translators of the most recent scholarly Rig Veda, 2014, even emphasize this fact, stating that this hymn typifies the, quote, Vedic mystery of simultaneous unity and diversity, unquote. And this is the earliest layer of the Rig Veda, which is the earliest composed, complete Indo-European religious text we have, the very beginning of the Indo-European theological record. As Jameson and Brereton state of this hymn, Rig Veda 3.55.1, quote, "The most obvious feature of this hymn is the refrain found in every verse. Quote, great is the one and only lordship of the gods, unquote, notable for its emphasis on unity, ekam, one and only, is the final word of each verse, and for the juxtaposition and implied identity of asuratvam, lordship, and devanam, gods, given that in later Vedic, the asuras and the devas are locked in eternal enmity. This familiar Vedic mystery of simultaneous unity and diversity is further exemplified by the references to numerous gods, generally unnamed but usually recognizable, especially in the second part of the hymn, in the manner of many all-god hymns, unquote. Here is the hymn in their translation. This is Rig Veda 3.55.1, quote, Then when the ancient dawns dawned forth, in the track of the cow a great imperishable syllable was born/was discerned, which tends to the commandments of the gods. Great is the one and only lordship of the gods, unquote. Aurobindo translates the final phrase as, quote, the vast, the mightiness of the gods, the one, ekam, unquote, which is validated by the fact that ekam, one, is indeed the final word of each line on which the thematic emphasis lands. The imperishable syllable, more specifically, mentioned in this hymn, calls to mind the primordial syllable Om, which is also the Brahman. Indeed, the word used for imperishable syllable here, aksharam, is defined as a synonym for Om throughout the rest of Vedic scripture. According to Aurobindo, the cow here, in whose track is found the imperishable syllable, is the Vedic goddess Aditi, whose name means the boundless. In the track of the boundless is found the imperishable syllable. This, of course, fits the overt theme of imperishableness and oneness in the verse. We thus have, quote, in the track of the boundless is found the unmoving/imperishable syllable. Great is the lordship/might of the gods, the one and only, unquote. What should also be mentioned is the way the fire god Agni is treated throughout the earliest layer of the Rig Veda, a treatment consistent through all Vedic scripture. Agni becomes, quote-unquote, all the gods, suggesting that he must be a vector of unity between them. It is even said that, quote, in Agni are all the gods. It's hard to read this other than as the gods being unified in, quote, one lordship, as in the previous hymn. From Rig Veda 5.3, which is again in the earliest layer of the Rig Veda, we read, quote, Thou, O Agni, art Varuna, when thou art born. Thou becomest Mitra, when thou art perfectly kindled. In thee are all the gods, O son of force. Thou art Indra, to the mortal who gives the sacrifice. Thou becomest Aryaman, when thou bearest the secret name of virgins. For the glory of thee, O Rudra, the Maruts brighten by their pressure that which is the brilliant and varied birth of thee. By thy glory, O Deva, the gods attain to right vision, and holding in themselves all the multiplicity of the vast manifestation, taste immortality. Men set Agni in them as the priest of the sacrifice. When desiring the immortality, they distribute to the gods the self-expression of the being, unquote. The solar lord Savitar, in similar fashion, quote, becomes both Pushan and Mitra in succession. To Savitar it is said, quote, Thou, O God, art Mitra, through thy righteous laws. Pushan art thou, O God, in all thy goings forth, unquote. Rig Veda 5.81.4-5. It is impossible to explain how one god can become another, quote-unquote, without accepting that they do not have rigid boundaries in a simple sense. The only way to explain this away is by rationalizing what is explicitly being stated in mystical terms, which is what secular scholars often do. The other common tactic is to simply ignore these lines entirely, which should discredit the historian. This is a mystical description of gods becoming one another in an endless cycle. Agni, the fire that forms each god, is one primary vector of the unity between them. They are within Agni, and Agni is them, and fundamentally, they are together as one lordship, the familiar theme of unity in diversity. The very earliest theological literature of the Indo-Europeans has a mystical framing, consistently emphasizing the unity of the gods via the fire and its essence. Quote, "Indeed, Rudra is Agni, and Agni is Rudra. They are one in nature, though not in intensity. Rudra is the terrible, frightening, quintessential Agni. He is the fury of fire, Taittiriya Samhita 2.2.2.3. Like fire but fiercer and even more luminous, wild, tremendous, Rudra is fire, lightning, and the sun. Mahabharata 13.146.4. Fire is the power of illumination and is concentrated in him. He burns, he is atrocious and full of heat. Like fire, he devours flesh, blood, and marrow. Mahabharata 13.146.7. The wild god, the essence of fire, is in the fire, in the waters, in the plants. He has entered all beings. KAS 40.5, Taittiriya Samhita 5.5.9.3, compare AT 7.87.1. Inwardly he marks them with his signature, unquote. That is from The Presence of Shiva by Stella Kromrush. And Shiva is also the binding knot of the pranas that form the fire itself. If Odin has a similar role as the binding knot and transcending essence of the united gods and of the sacrifice, then it would not be hard to tell why performing disunited and individualized sacrifices in the absence of Odin would go directly against what Odin stands for and would amount to an offensive heresy. No wonder then why Mythothin gets exiled and killed, and his burial site spreads sudden death and pestilence, testifying to his abominations. Only beheading and driving a stake through his corpse brings an end to the pestilence. The heresy that he stood guilty of must have been severe if his corpse emitted such malevolent forces. Daksha also is beheaded in his violent conclusion, and thus Mythothin might parallel Daksha, the rebellious sacrificer who is beheaded, and he would then be a continuation of the servant that Frigg shamefully embraced. However, I see one possible alternate reading, and I actually lean toward this reading myself, and that would be to align Mythothin not with Daksha, the sacrificer, but with the main god he sacrifices to. In some versions, this is left unstated, but in others it is specifically Vishnu, who is worshipped in Daksha's rebellious sacrifice. Saxo says that Mythothin changes the sacrifice to lead the people to pay holy observance to his name. He is not only leading the ritual toward the separation of gods, but he is also particularly setting himself up as object of worship in the absence of Odin. Daksha and his parallels actually never set themselves up as the one worshipped, other than the fact that they merge into the sacrifice in a sense, but not usually overtly so. Instead, consistently they are the sacrificer, and not the god worshipped in the sacrifice per se, even if the concepts can merge. Let's recall then how I have shown Fenrir to be the Norse Vishnu in my previous video stream, Fenrir, the Norse Narasimha. Recall that if Fenrir is killed, the gods are concerned that his blood will defile the holy places in Snorri's version. See Gylfaginning chapter 34, which is similar to Mythothin's death. In the scene paralleling Fenrir's binding, as I've shown, Cuchulainn is beheaded, and Mahavishnu is also beheaded, as is Mythothin. In addition, in some versions of the Daksha's sacrifice myth, Vishnu is beheaded. The Vishnu-type deity underlying the wolf Fenrir clearly can take multiple forms, including that of a king, thus it would be no issue for Mythothin to be a man rather than a wolf, especially in a pseudo-historical euhemerizing account. Clearly, this is a question we cannot definitively answer, but based on the evidence presented, it appears most likely that Mythothin is either a parallel of Daksha or of the god who becomes the focus of his sacrifice, apparently Vishnu. If it was Vishnu, it might explain why Mythothin appears distinct from the servant that Frigg has the affair with, and it might also explain why Mythothin's corpse brings a sort of curse of pestilence, as Fenrir's blood also is seen as defiling. Vishnu's fate is different in different versions of Daksha's sacrifice. For instance, in the Linga Purana, Vishnu is beheaded, and his head is blown by the wind into the fire. The Kurma Purana, after describing a contest in which both parties occasionally prevail, makes Brahma interpose and separate the combatants. The Kasi Kanda of the Skanda Purana describes Vishnu as defeated and at the mercy of Virabhadra, who is prohibited by a voice from heaven from destroying his antagonist. And Shiva Purana 2.2.27.13 says that, quote, Vishnu himself was the presiding officer along with the Maruds, unquote, of the sacrifice. Meanwhile, Skanda Purana and other versions identify Vishnu with the sacrifice itself as the Yajna Purusha, and also identify him as its supervisor. Yajna Purusha and Yajneshvara are after all epithets of Vishnu, which identify him with the sacrifice itself. From Skanda Purana, quote, Virabhadra said, You are the Yajna Purusha, here performing and supervising the great Yajna. By your vigor and power, you act as the protector of Daksha, the enemy of the three-eyed Lord. Unquote. So if we put these together, we have all of the details. Vishnu as the sacrifice itself, and as its supervisor, and as the one the sacrifice is directed toward, who is defeated and either beheaded or driven away in the end. These then potentially align well with both the Welsh Naton, who is positioned as the sacrifice itself, and Mythothin, who is the object and supervisor of the sacrifice, and who is driven away and beheaded. And thus we are brought much closer to confirming both of these as Vishnu parallels. Those who have read my articles or book know that I have said for years that Mars Neto, N-E-T-O, or Gaelic Nate, N-E-I-T or N-E-T, are actually names of the Celtic Vishnu, who also incarnates as Cuchulainn. In the Welsh case, we have this god named Naton, but it is spelled N-W-Y-T-H-O-N. However, it is also found spelled N-A-E-T-H-O-N, Nathon. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's version, however, we find the name spelled N-E-T-O-N, Naton, very similar to Mars Nato and Gaelic Nate. Therefore, this Nathon, father of Killadir, whose heart is eaten in the Welsh version of this Daksha sacrifice myth, does indeed point most strongly to Vishnu as his equivalent in the Vedic tradition. To clarify that, Gwythyr has his heart eaten in the Welsh version, making him the sacrifice. Gwythyr, N-W-Y-T-H-O-N, is also spelled Nathon, N-A-E-T-H-O-N, and then Naton, N-E-T-O-N, in Geoffrey of Monmouth's version. I have a chapter in my first book explaining how Mars Neto, N-E-T-O, from Spain, and the Gaelic Nate, N-E-I-T or N-E-T, are probably the Vishnu type. And here we have Naton as the one who is defeated and eaten as the sacrifice. This supports the idea that Mythothin could indeed also be Vishnu, since he is showing up in the Welsh version as Gwythyr, aka Naton, and Mythothin is the one who is worshipped in the sacrifice and then beheaded like Vishnu. Thus, his possible existence in the Welsh version supports this identification in the Norse version. I urge you to watch my video stream on Vishnu and read my article on or chapter on him as well, as there is a lot that supports this. So the Norse version of this myth, preserved with many vital details here, also brings into focus the fact that this myth type was always about the theology of the sacrifice, even from Proto-Indo-European times, and not only in the Hindu versions. Furthermore, if we compare the sacrificial theologies at issue in the Norse and Hindu versions, it suggests that the myth may have always been about something like unity versus separation in ritual, or in technical terms, something like monism versus hard polytheism. the latter being the complete separation of the gods and the exclusion of the transcendental unifying principle that Odin and Rudra represent. Saxo's narrative has preserved a grave warning: do not make an absolute distinction between the gods. Greek mythology has a fairly straightforward variation of this myth type, which greatly reinforces the idea that this is indeed the myth of the horned god. Just as Shiva and Rudra have female counterparts called Shiva and Rudrani, who are consorts of the gods and are seen as forms of Sati, aka Parvati, so Greek myth treats the parallel of Sati more as a female form of the Rudraic god Apollo, and thus presents her as his sister. Note that Fauna, whose name is also a female form of Faunus, just as Rudrani is of Rudra or Shiva is of Shiva, is said to be both sister and consort of Faunus. So these roles are blurred in the case of Rudra Shiva's female half in some cases. Sometimes Rudra and his consort also form a hermaphroditic unity with male and female halves, called Ardhanarishvara, and this may be similar to the duality of the twins Apollo and Artemis in the Greek case. This equivocation between consort and sister is confirmed by the mythic parallel in question, for Artemis appears here in the position equivalent to Sati. Artemis, a hunter quite similar to her brother Apollo, is seen bathing by a figure named Actaeon. The variants give different versions, but in summary, Actaeon is transformed into a stag, foreseeing Artemis thus indisposed, and then either his or Artemis's hounds, depending on the version, chase him down and dismember him. Wikipedia summarizes the sources and interpretations for this myth. Quote, Apollodorus 3.4.4, Nonnus 5.287, Ovid, Metamorphosis 3.131, Diodorus Siculus 4.81.4, Callimachus, hymn 5. This version also appears in Callimachus's fifth hymn as a mythical parallel to the blinding of Tiresias after he sees Athena bathing. In Greek mythology, Actaeon is widely thought to symbolize ritual human sacrifice in attempt to please a god or goddess. The dogs symbolize the sacrificers, and Actaeon symbolizes the sacrifice. See Biedermann Hans, The Dictionary of Symbolism, unquote. So we see that Actaeon becomes the sacrifice, and in this sense also Daksha becomes the sacrifice that he performs, and then has his own head cut off, in a sense also becoming the sacrifice in that way as well. In one version, Actaeon is in a similar serving position to Artemis, as in Norse and Gaelic versions it is a servant who sparks the would-be love triangle. And at least one version more strongly implies amorous ambitions in Actaeon, besides merely seeing her naked. As wolves and hounds are symbols and sometimes embodiments of the Rudra-type gods, a god type with a whole wolf cult dedicated to it, as well as the Vratya dog priests of India, see Chris Kershaw's book on Odin, so hounds can easily be stand-ins for the manifestation of the Rudraic power. Specifically, these hounds would parallel the incarnations of Rudra Shiva, who perform the actual attack and dismemberment, his emissaries, Virabhadra and Bhadrakali. Remember that Rudra Shiva too sits back remote, while his emissaries carry out the slaughter, as also his parallel Kumarbi does in the Hittite version, while Tarhunta and Ninurta take on the emissary attack squad role there. Thus the Rudraic god, who would be Apollo, remaining absent or invisible in this myth, and only acting through the hounds, is nicely in keeping with the Indian and Hittite versions. Thus we have the female and male representative of the Rudra-type deity, since his spouse can also appear as his twin sister or female other half, etc., and a lesser companion of theirs who brings shame on the female by improper proximity to her. He flees in the form of a deer and is dismembered by what are presumably the representatives of the Rudraic god Apollo, the hounds. This seems without a doubt to be the same myth, and Actaeon becoming a horned stag adds another very strong support to the fact that this overall pattern indeed belongs to the horned one, i.e. Cernunnos, and that it is his primary and most widely attested mythos.
Actaeon, like Jered and Daksha,
And Karunta is the one who flees in the form of a deer after a shameful moment with the female counterpart of the Rudraic god. Thus we see our Indo-European Cernunnos type revealed in these different variations. In Part 2, we will venture further beyond the Indo-European horizon and discover this myth type extending even into the Bible. My book, Taliesin's Map, is available from Amazon. Link in the description. Make sure to like and subscribe for more groundbreaking mythology videos.